Welcome everyone to MHPN's first webinar of 2025. My name is Xiaohan Bao Smith, and I will be your moderator today. We are going to hear about removing barriers and building bridges, harnessing the power of preservation to uplift marginalized communities. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I would like to go over some Zoom items. First of all, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And if you have any technical difficulties, please also type them into the Q&A box. The chat box will be used to share links or resources discussed during the webinar. Both the Q&A and chat boxes are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you don't see them, please go ahead and wiggle your mouse. They should pop up. And please participate in the survey after the webinar concludes. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We support the sustainability and economic viability of Michigan's historic places through advocacy, education, and direct action. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. If you're not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. Our webinar series is supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council and National Endowment for the Arts. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce you our speaker, Kemba Brynan, AIA. She is a senior architect and associate of Queen Evans. Kemba's bio is on our website. I will share you the link to it in a minute in the chat box. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our speaker. And Kemba, please go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Just going to share my screen. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for MHPN for inviting me to speak and providing an introduction. This presentation that I'm giving this afternoon is one that I recently gave at an international conference on heritage conservation in Montreal. The conference was the APT, the Association of Preservation Trust, who joined forces with the National Trust of Canada to provide a conference that was focused on heritage and conservation. And I was excited that they recently added 2 new tracks that provided information for how heritage professionals and advocates can address legacies of erasure and create an inclusive culture of conservation. So I will be sharing that presentation with you today that I presented in Montreal with a few added photos as one of the projects is undergoing construction and has moved on a little bit farther along in construction. So today I'll be speaking about 2 unique preservation projects that were each built in the 1900s with one purpose in mind. A church, which you can see in the upper right, that was built to serve a religious community, and a wall, you can see at the bottom, that was constructed to divide a residential community. So I'll tell the story of how and why each structure was built and eventually repurposed and reimagined to serve and empower the broader community. And I'll discuss how, in considering opportunities to repurpose historic buildings and structures, context matters, engaging the community is critical, and how preservation can be used to empower communities. The Peace Hub Community Resource Center is located in a former church in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The church was constructed in the 1950s, and when the small congregation moved into this 8,000 square foot building, it was an emerging area with housing and businesses that sprung up around the Willow Run factory during the war effort. And you can see here, this factory is here, and this church is located right here. By the 2010s, this zip code had one of the highest reoccurring needs for emergency assistance of food and shelter. So a well-established community center in neighboring Ann Arbor decided that this was the ideal location to expand their services to meet the needs of the community. So in 2024, the church was repurposed as a community resource center. So to provide a bit of historic context, the church building is located near the Willow Run factory that was constructed to mass produce the bomber aircraft during World War II. At the time of its construction, the 5 million square foot facility was one of the largest factories in the world. And at its wartime peak, it made about one aircraft every 63 seconds. And it actually produced about half of all the bomber aircrafts during the World War II. So when the factory was constructed, most of the workers that were planning to work in the factory lived about 20 miles to the east in Detroit. They had no way to get to the site in Ypsilanti, and most didn't want to stay in the area. They just wanted to make daily commutes. So this spurred the realization that the government needed to create a highway to get workers to this factory as quickly as possible. So you can see in the bottom right where just the excitement around that new the new highway when that was put in place. The new highway brought workers to the factory, but it also spurred development of businesses and residential areas that supported the needs of the new influx of workers. But the wartime effort was very short-lived. So after the war, the Willow Run factory shifted to cargo plane production, but this didn't generate nearly the amount of jobs that were needed during the war effort. So the plant was eventually decommissioned with a small fraction used for freight and corporate aircrafts in a small museum. So by 2010, the area around the Willow Run factory that at once had so much opportunity and vibrancy during wartime production was well into an economic decline. So the highways that had expedited the daily commute of wartime workers were now serving as physical barriers that isolated these communities from grocery stores and work opportunities. So you can see that lack of opportunity in the Ypsilanti area reflected in this countywide opportunity index. So the area in red represents very low access to opportunity. So you see a lot of red here in Ypsilanti and near that Willow Run factory. Whereas blue areas, like you can see around Ann Arbor, represent very high access to opportunity. So in the red area, about 54% of children live below the poverty line, and that area suffers from racial disparities in income and poverty, disparities in educational attainment, economic opportunity, and there's real housing and food insecurity. But if we go just a few miles west to Ann Arbor, we see that they have very high access of opportunity, and actually only 12% of children in the Ann Arbor area live below the poverty line. So if we take a closer look at the neighboring town of Ann Arbor, which has really high levels of opportunity and low levels of child poverty, we can see that the preservation of their cultural resources is one of the things that makes the city so desirable. So the Carytown district is one example of an area in Ann Arbor that has adaptively reused their historic buildings, dating as far back as the 1800s, to house high-end shops and restaurants. So oftentimes when we adaptively reuse and renovate neighborhoods, it ends up displacing the local residents that live there. And that was definitely the case with the Carytown area of Ann Arbor. So before Carytown was transformed into shops and eateries, it was a historically Black neighborhood known as the Old West Side. So Blacks owned homes, businesses, and attended the predominantly Black Jones School. So at that time, Ann Arbor was actually 48% African American. But when Carytown was created and its former markets were converted into restaurants and eateries and high-end shops, many of the Black families that had lived there for generations were priced out. This had a really devastating impact on the historically Black community of Ann Arbor. So at the time that this photo was taken in front of the Jones School, Ann Arbor was 48% African American. But since that time, with the conversion of Carytown and gentrification and housing prices increasing, the percentage of Blacks living in Ann Arbor has reduced to what it is now, which is only 6%. So one of the positive outcomes of this massive displacement of Black residents from Ann Arbor was the founding of a community center about 50 years ago that emerged to provide wraparound services and resources for the community in need, specifically the African American community that was displaced. So this community center is called Peace Neighborhood Center. They're located on the old west side of Ann Arbor, and they were keenly aware of the resources and needs of the displaced community. So for the past few years, they have kept a watchful eye on this neighborhood in particular, this neighborhood here in Ypsilanti, because over 70% of their emergency assistance requests came from this exact neighborhood. So when the church near the Willow Run factory decided to sell their building due to declining membership, it became the perfect opportunity for Peace Neighborhood Center to adaptively reuse an existing building to provide resources and services to the community. So before any designs were drawn up, Peace Neighborhood Center spent about 2 years in the discovery phase. This was connecting with community residents, community leaders, elected officials, and potential community partners. And what they learned before we were even brought on to do the project really helped guide our efforts in the design of the space. So Peace Neighborhood Center decided to partner with local agencies who already served residents in this area, who could bring vital programs and services to the Community Resource Center to help support people where they live. So in June of 2023, Peace Neighborhood Center took ownership of the 8,000 square foot brick masonry building, which is located on 2.1 acres of land. The project team for the design and the construction phase is Quinn Evans Architects and Phoenix Contractors, and the construction budget was about $2.5 million. So we're currently at the tail end of construction, and we've spent about the last year transforming this space into a full-service community resource center that can provide real wraparound services for communities, for the families in the neighborhood. So this building, the church building, is located in a real food desert. The nearest grocery store is over 2 miles away. And as I mentioned earlier, this area of town has a child poverty rate of about 54%. So in designing the space, it was important to situate the new commercial kitchen at the center of the space. The commercial kitchen will provide weekly community meals as well as preparing snacks for school-aged children during after-school programs and community events. We also included a designated space for a food pantry right here, which is adjacent to another larger space here, which will help with staging. So in order to transform the space from a church to a community resource center, we demolished most of the partition walls and non-load-bearing CMU walls. We located the kitchen at the heart of the space, and we opened up the floor plan to allow this circular flow, which the client was really excited about, to be able to, the fact that you could come in and just kind of walk around. There weren't any dead end locations, and everything was easily accessible. We also located office spaces close to the reception and a little conference room area. So here are a few images of what the church looked like before we started construction. This is the worship space, which we knew would be an ideal location for large community gatherings. And it had some features that we really wanted to keep, such as these beautiful vaulted ceilings and exposed beams and the windows, but other things that really gave it a dated feel, such as the chandeliers, the raised stage, which of course was important when it was a church, but would limit it being a flexible use space, and just the look of these windows, which were small pane windows and glass black windows. So in order to open up the space, we removed a few features that were really causing it to be constricted, such as this low ceiling here, which we eliminated to just open it up, as you can see here in this construction photo. And we started replacing these dated chandeliers with more linear lighting to give it a more modern feel. The other thing that we did is we decided to paint the wood paneling a lighter color. One of the things they mentioned was that the space felt really dark, and that was on account of just the floor and the ceiling being a darker color. So we lightened things up by painting that paneling white. We also took out that stage and filled it in to allow for more flexible uses. So a few simple changes that we made really helped to transform this space into an event space that can be used for a variety of purposes. Also adding like a dash of color back here really helped to modernize the space. This is where the altar previously was located. And then also providing different window panes here, and the window openings brought in light without having to be filtered through the glass blocks. And then the linear lighting really added a nice modern touch. And you can see in the lower left that they've already started using the space. We imagine that there's a wide variety of ways that they can make use of the space. Besides, it looks like they're having some staff training in the lower left. So at the back of the building is a multi-purpose room that we wanted to use for gatherings ranging from after-school programs, community meetings, and staging for the food pantry. So this was another area of the building that had a real constricted feel, partially due to the fact that the ceiling was low and it was being used as a storage space. But when we looked above the ceiling, we were really surprised to see a few feet below the existing deck. They had the church had filled it with insulation because that back room was always cold. But once we replaced the HVAC system, we didn't need a few feet of insulation. So we were able to open up the space. So here you can see how the space starts to look during construction as we take away that drop ceiling and just start to paint those exposed trusses in the ceiling deck. And here we have some more staff training that's happening. Everyone's really excited as this building's starting to get finished. And this is that same space, completely transformed with new flooring. The walls have been painted. We have linear fixtures, which are making it look much more modern. And we have an extra few feet of space, which gives it a much more open feel. And here we've decided the owner wanted to be able to use this back space as two separate spaces or one space. So we have an accordion door, a folding panel door, which they can easily operate to kind of divide up the space as needed. And here are just a few additional images of the space. Again, it's still in construction. It should be finishing up in the next few weeks. But this is looking on the upper left is looking, this is the entry area. So we didn't change the exterior door, but we did make this window here a bit larger so that someone sitting at the reception desk here can kind of look out and see what's happening. You can see the reception desk here is being put in place, and we recommended a partial height wall to provide more visibility. And in the lower left, stepping a few feet back, you can see that from the hallway, you can look out into the reception area. And we also found creative ways to capture space that wasn't planned to be used originally. So we had a really wide hallway here, and so we just added a little office nook where someone can sit and get some work done or have a quick meeting. In the upper right is the commercial kitchen, which again is the heart of the space. They'll be having weekly meals for the community that will be cooked and prepared in this large commercial kitchen. And then the lower right is one of the two offices that we've put into the space. And you can see we still have those beautiful exposed ceiling beams that were part of the original aesthetic of the church, but we've painted them a different color than the exposed wood. I guess that's the exposed wood deck. And so that gives it a nice modern feel, and it emphasizes it without giving it a dated look. So all in all, it's been a 3-year effort to transform an existing church into a community resource center. But the construction will be completed in a few weeks, and they've already started training staff to make use of this building to better serve the community. So the second project I'm going to talk about is the Birwood Wall, which is located in Detroit, Michigan. The Birwood Wall was constructed in 1941 when a real estate agent was looking for a way to secure federal financing for a new residential subdivision. So in order for the development to be successful, he needed to ensure that future homeowners could receive financing to purchase lots in the new subdivision. But there was one problem. The banks considered his proposed residential subdivision too risky because it was adjacent to a historic Black neighborhood. So in response, the developer proposed a very unusual solution. He built a concrete wall to separate the Black residential community from his new subdivision. And this was the notorious Birwood Wall. So to provide a bit of context of that historic African-American community that was there prior to the wall, the community is called the 8 Mile Wyoming area in Detroit, and it's a historically working-class Black neighborhood that developed in the early 1900s. and provided an alternative to the highly segregated and crowded conditions that many Blacks were forced to live in closer to downtown and the Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods. So although there were a few Black middle-class enclaves in Detroit, many Black residents who attempted to move into these enclaves were met with resistance and violence and often forced to abandon their homes. So between 1900 and 1920, over 1,000 African Americans purchased former farmland and built homes in the neighborhood that sits on Detroit's northwest border. So when it was originally settled in the early 1900s, this neighborhood was isolated from the crowded conditions of the city, and over time the city actually expanded and grew around it. So this Black community is the oldest Black residential community in Detroit, and it was a starting point for many working class Black Detroiters, one of homeownership, revitalization, and a real sense of community. So securing financing for homeownership is critical, and this often comes by way of a bank. But at that time in Detroit, and in most cities throughout the US, most banks refused to give mortgages to Black residents, and this refusal was actually backed by federal policies. In 1933, after the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted a series of programs to stabilize the economy and provide relief to Americans who had lost their homes. In order to ensure that these federal programs did not back risky mortgages, the program engaged local real estate agents to actually appraise the neighborhood and produce a color-coded residential security map. So the neighborhoods that were considered the safest were colored in green or blue. So those were areas with high demand for housing. But the neighborhoods that were considered risky were colored in red or yellow. So in practice, Black neighborhoods were always covered in red, even if they were well-maintained or middle-class neighborhoods. So this is the color coding system that's known as redlining. And property owners in redlined areas were excluded from eligible mortgages just because of the racial compositions of the neighborhood, rather than the actual conditions of the home. So in the 1930s, this is actually a map of what Detroit looked like in terms of the redlined areas. And every area that's in red was deemed too hazardous to give mortgages to homeowners because the neighborhoods were predominantly Black. So in the mid-1930s, local ads began to appear in the local newspaper for Blackstone Number 6, which was the name of the new development adjacent to the established Black community in Northwest Detroit. The ads made it clear as to what type of person was allowed to move into this new development. The new houses could only be occupied by persons of pure, unmixed Caucasian race. It wasn't just the residential security maps that prevented Blacks from getting mortgages in redlined areas. There was a specific language that was legally permitted in deeds that could really restrict who could actually purchase homes. The Federal Housing Administration, which was a Roosevelt administration agency that ensured bank-provided mortgages for first-time buyers, and the language in these manuals actually enforced segregation by favoring racially restrictive covenants and property deeds, and noting that they were more effective than zoning ordinances and providing protection from adverse influences. So the developer of Blackstone Park Number 6 knew that there was a federal ban on funding developments in close proximity to redline neighborhoods, but there was a loophole. The FHA would support developments if there was a barrier of some sort between a Black neighborhood and a white neighborhood to protect the neighborhood from integration. So usually this just took the form of a virtual separation, such as wide streets or parks. In the case of the Blackstone development, the developer actually constructed a concrete wall to physically separate the new development from the adjacent Black community. And here you can see that wall. Here is the historically Black neighborhood that had been in place since the early 1900s. And Blackstone Park Number 6 was the development that was proposed. So the Birwood Wall is a 6-foot high, 1 foot wide, 2,200 foot long concrete wall. It spans three blocks. It completely divides the 8 Mile, Wyoming neighborhood. It's roughly about half a mile long, and it was constructed of precast concrete panels that are 1 foot wide by 6 feet high and 20 feet long. These panels were slotted into channels within H-shaped posts, and up until recently, the wall was exposed concrete. And up until this day, the wall maintains a high degree of integrity. So these are a few images of children who lived on opposite sides of the wall in the 1940s. So white residents lived in the new development, which was here on the west side of the wall, and Black residents lived, as they had since the early 1900s, on the east side of the wall. FHA loans to purchase homes were readily available for the white residents who lived on the west side of the wall, but those same loans weren't made available to the Black residents who lived on the east side of the wall. So at the time of the wall's construction in 1941, there was a great deal of outrage from the Black community because of the construction of the wall. One editorial in Detroit's Black newspaper, The Chronicle, noted, quote, "The invisible walls of racial prejudice already confront us daily in this democracy, and the appearance of an actual wall of concrete represents the measure of this racial bigotry," unquote. The plan to provide an artificial barrier to divide these two communities ultimately failed. In 1950, about 9 years after this wall was constructed, the first Black family moved to the west side of the wall, and after a few years, Black families were living on both sides of the wall. For decades, the wall remained as a permanent reminder of segregation. And in the years that followed, there was a lot of discussion about what to do with the wall. Should it be torn down? Should it remain? The community ultimately decided to keep it as a memory of the past and to reclaim it. In 1948, the Supreme Court overturned the legality of racially restricted covenants, but social pressure and segregation continues to limit African Americans' housing choices and economic opportunities. In 2006, the local Detroit artists and area residents decided to paint a mural along the wall, showing important scenes from Black history, like Sojourner Truth leading children through the Underground Railroad, and images of life, reflecting life in the 8 Mile, Wyoming neighborhood. In 2021, the Birwood Wall was added to the National Register of Historic Places under National Register Criterion A at the national level of significance for its association with the history of segregation and the practice of redlining during the mid-20th century. So the nomination for the wall was prepared by two of my coworkers at Quinn Evans, Ruth Mills and Sandra Little. And when the nomination was submitted, I was really proud to be sitting in the room as the vice chair of the Michigan State Historic Designation and Review Board. So in conclusion, our cultural resources have important stories to tell and are important reminders of who we are as a community, where we have been, and how we can uplift, inspire, and empower our communities. When considering how to repurpose historic buildings and structures, please remember that context matters. Engage the community and expect the unexpected. Who would have thought that the community would decide to embrace and reclaim that wall? And history is created by all. Therefore, historic preservation should be considered by all. Thank you for listening, and that concludes my presentation. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Kemba, for sharing this presentation. And I do see a few questions in our Q&A box, and our audience can continue to type in your questions. So I will start with the first question here. Okay. Could you please say more about the two new program tracks that were added to the APT National Trust Conference in Montreal?
Oh gosh. Sure. Let me see if I can pull that up. If you give me a second. That's a great question. I just want to do it justice by speaking towards it. And I actually was just looking at the two tracks earlier this morning. So I'm just going to pull something up really quickly and read off of it. So the tracks were actually track 4 and track 5. I spoke towards track 4, which was titled Advancing Diversity, Inclusion, and Reconciliation. And I'll just read the blurb of both these tracks just to provide a best summary that comes from the actual conference organizers. So for track 4, while the heritage conservation sector successfully inspired and empowered people to protect heritage places, many perspectives and narratives have been marginalized or excluded. How can heritage professionals, site operators, advocates, policymakers, and others address legacies of erasure, rectify biased practices, and create a truly inclusive culture of conservation? This track explores how new social and ethical imperatives are transforming historic preservation, including what is defined as heritage and by whom. So that was track 4, and I spoke of, that my presentation was kind of geared towards that track. There were a lot of great presentations, including a lot having to do with reconciliation. It was hosted in Montreal, and so there were a lot of Indigenous members of the Indigenous community who were speaking about the history of reconciliation and the history of erasure. And track 5 was titled Removing Systemic Barriers to Heritage-Led Reuse. And I'll just read that word as well. When the state of the economy, development industry, government policies, and community concerns are in sync, they create a climate for conservation and reuse, which shapes what is possible. In many jurisdictions, heritage is seen as a cost versus an investment, conservation a barrier to reuse, and heritage protection an elitist, NIMBY tool shielding affluent areas from increased urban density. How can the heritage sector be more effective at removing systemic barriers to reuse, leveling the playing field to compete with new construction, and ensuring equal access to heritage conservation expertise for all income brackets? So this was my first time attending the conference, the Association of Preservation Technologies Conference in National Trust in Canada. So I can't really provide an overview of what the conference was like prior, but it was really interesting to see that they devoted these 2 tracks to inclusion and to addressing barriers to preservation, because many of us, myself included, kind of came into preservation really seeing it as something elite, that you have to have done something, you have to be a notable person, you have to be someone famous, or there's always been a pretty high bar to conservation and preservation. So the fact that we can now the fact that looking at untold stories is now being considered as worth a conference track and worth pursuing was really interesting to me and exciting, that preservation is starting to open up to those untold stories.
Oh.
I think that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, next question. Before the church was adaptively reused as a community center, did it go through a period of disuse? It looks like as if it were in good condition.
It was in very good condition. They did have declining membership over the years. And it sounds as though for years they were thinking of what to do to further their mission. They were located in an area that had slowly become more low income. So it sounded as though they had started doing a lot of outreach to the surrounding communities. There was a clothing exchange that was there, small areas for food pantry, but it really wasn't suitable for those purposes yet. So it really became a great way of them extending their mission when they were able to partner with a community center in neighboring Ann Arbor and just figure out a way to reuse their building to serve the broader good. We did end up having to do a full gut. Like I mentioned earlier, the HVAC system was pretty low, was pretty bad. That was redone. The roof needed to be redone. So that's not unusual with buildings of that age, but it was in fairly good condition. Mm-hmm. They just didn't have the membership to continue supporting it as a church in that location.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question. When you brought together the community stakeholders about the adaptive reuse project, were they on board right away or did they need convincing?
So that's a great question. And all of that exploratory community engagement actually happened before we were brought on board as a design team to do the work. I was actually at a unrelated meeting at Peace Neighborhood Center, and I heard the director, Bonnie Phillips, mention the fact that they've been working with the community for a year to come up with ideas and to come up with partnership opportunities, and they were just looking for an architect. So of course, that was my cue, and I ran over and reminded him that I was an architect and I'd love to work on the project. So we were brought on board long after that had happened. We were able to benefit from about a year of engagement that the community center had already done in terms of understanding what the needs were of the center, how it should function, and what the partnering agencies, who the partnering agencies would be.
Next question. Did the church property have to be rezoned for the community center use?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I don't believe so. It's in, I do not believe so. It's in a residential area, and my project architect would know this answer. I am not sure, but I could look into that. I know at some point we were wondering if it needed to be rezoned, but I don't remember what the outcome was for that effort. But we didn't have any problems moving forward with the permit and with the changes.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be that, gosh, I don't want to conjecture. So I'll just leave it with I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that and let you know.
Okay, next question. Is a community center a maker space? For example, where a fledgling cupcake maker can use a commercial kitchen one afternoon to make their products for sale elsewhere.
Oh, wow, that's a great idea. I don't know the answer to that. I would recommend that you reach out to the executive director of the Peace Neighborhood Center. Bonnie Phillips is the executive director whose brainchild this was. He's with Peace Neighborhood Center in Ann Arbor. So he would be able to kind of let you know if it is a makerspace, if it's open for others. I know that it's supposed to be a community resource and they have partners in mind, but I'd imagine they might be open to such creative partnership as baking and cupcake making. That would be a real bonus, I'd imagine. So I'd encourage you to reach out directly to Peace Neighborhood Center and see if that's something that they would be open to. It hasn't opened its doors yet, but it's going to be opening in the next few weeks.
Oh, exciting. Okay, next question. Did you all use tax credits or federal funding for the church building?
We did not use tax credits, but Peace Neighborhood Center received a lot of grants that helped fund the project. It was a $2.5 million construction budget, which is pretty large for a nonprofit, but we did not use tax credits. It was grant dollars and donations from the Peace Neighborhood Center community, which they have a very generous network of donors in the area.
Wow, that's great. Okay, next question. Where the Birwood Wall can still be seen, its existence has been acknowledged by and recognized. But do residents know how long it is and and that it is still hidden behind their properties?
I'd imagine that it's been around for so long, and I know it's been a sore spot and a source of debate for so long. My understanding was when it was nominated, when it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, there was a fair amount of community engagement that took place to see what the community, if it should be nominated, and just a lot of discussion with community beforehand to see what should be done with the wall. This wasn't the only place in America where walls were put up during redlining, but those other communities, the walls were torn down. So I would I can't speak, of course, for every resident in the that Northwest neighborhood, but I believe that many are well familiar. With that, with the location of the wall, and it's been, beautifully painted with murals, and a portion of the wall actually faces a public park where a lot of neighborhood children spend their time. So I'd say most are pretty familiar with it.
Okay, next question. Did the artists provide a mural on the west side of the wall?
Oh gosh, I hope so. The photos that I provided, I'm not sure if they're on the east or the west, but since 1950s, both sides of the wall were fully integrated. So I don't know the answer to that, but there is a National Register nomination that's publicly available that should be able to, I'm sure it's listed in there, if it's on both sides or if it's on just one side of the wall. But that's a great question. And I'm sorry I don't have an answer.
Okay, so the next questions are the neighborhoods on both sides of the wall listed on the National Register?
Oh, Megan, okay. One of my fellow Quinn Evans, thank you, Megan. One of my fellow historic preservationists from Quinn Evans said, I think she said it's only on the west. Do you say it's only on the, she put it in the chat, but how did you say? Okay, so Megan, one of the historic preservationists in my office says, or historian says that she believes the mural is only on the east side. Okay, thanks, Megan. Sorry, can you repeat the next question?
Oh, yes. Are the neighborhoods on both sides of the wall listed on the National Register?
I do not know. The wall is listed. Detroit has lots of, on the national, I don't believe on the national, I don't know for sure. They could be listed on the local historic district. Detroit has lots of local historic districts. And I don't know the answer to that, but that would be, that's something I can get back to someone with. There's also maps of Detroit showing what areas are listed in the local historic district. And again, the national, you can find online what areas are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, let's move on to the next question. Could you say a few words about the review of the Birwood Wall by the State Historic Preservation Review Board? It was a unanimous vote.
Sure. I know we were really, the wall initially kind of was introduced to us as part of the multiple, historic civil rights sites in Detroit, a large nomination that kind of looked at the civil rights history of Detroit and different structures and buildings and sites that reflected the civil rights history of Detroit and the history of African Americans. And that was a really exciting nomination that happened that predated the Birwood Wall nomination, because it talked about the fact that even though a building might not have a high level of integrity, what happened there from a historic standpoint, from a social standpoint, was significant enough that the actual integrity of the structure was secondary. And so that multi-property nomination introduced the Birwood Wall and other civil rights sites and properties throughout the city of Detroit. And then there were nominations that individual nominations that came out of that. And the Birwood Wall was one of them. And it was exciting because it's intact. It's a painful reminder of history, but it's an important reminder. It's something that happened in terms of redlining and segregation throughout the United States, but there's very few physical evidences of it, such as an actual concrete wall. And so I feel that that's why it was listed as national level of significance, just because of the importance of it in terms of recognizing the history of redlining and segregation. So it was, yes, it was unanimous vote. I think I might have reclused myself because I work at Gwen Evans. So with the exception of those who had to recuse themselves, it was unanimous, and just an exciting nomination to see that sites such as this can be considered and recognized for their worth and their value in terms of our history in this country.
Thank you. Next question. What are the residential neighborhoods like today on both sides of the wall?
Gosh, I don't know. I know that I don't know. I'm really not familiar with the northwest section of Detroit, so I can't say. I know Detroit has, it's lost a lot of its population, so it has a lot of housing stock that has some which has maintained a lot of integrity, and others which haven't, just because of the population loss that's happened over the last few decades. And I don't know if, in terms of that northwest area, where that falls in that line.
Mhm.
And I haven't been to that area in quite a while. But I'd imagine some of that might be described in the nomination, which is online, the Birwood Wall.
Mhm. Okay, next question. What is the physical condition of the Birwood Wall? Do the slabs of the concrete and the upright supports need repair?
Well, the nomination noted that it had a high level of integrity, so I imagine that that it's still pretty much intact.
Mhm.
It was built to last, pretty solid, 1 foot thick panels. Yeah, so gosh, can't speak towards every foot of that wall, but from reading in the National Register nomination that it has a high level of integrity, I imagine it's in pretty good shape and isn't going anywhere unless it's forcibly taken down. But that again would be a great, that's likely answered in the nomination that my coworkers prepared. Oh, okay. And Megan said, she says it's still intact when I saw it a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to next question. So the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office has been very purposeful in surveying and getting designated resources important to underrepresented communities. Are you able to share what's coming next?
Oh gosh. Well, I no longer have my ear to the ground because I finished my 2 terms on the review board. In terms of what's happening with grants and other things. But I know that there's others on this call and with MHPN who can kind of speak more towards that.
Okay, next question. So the document you showed showing the red line areas. Is that something you all created, or is that a way to find that information online at the Federal Housing Agency?
So that document was actually an article that was online that talked about the redlining. I pulled a few images from that online article. So I don't know the best way to share things with people that are asking for specific questions, but I can share a link to that. I guess if you send me an email, I can send you a link to that article. It was really helpful to see just what redlining looks like. And even though that redlining map was from 1930s, we still see the impacts of redlining today in cities throughout the country. We still see areas of segregation that are based on policies that were put in place 100 years ago. But if you can email me, and I don't know what's the best way to, I guess, contact people that have questions when I'm asking the facilitator.
Yeah, so I have Canva's email, and after this webinar concludes, I will send you all the participants an email with the link to the recording. And then, so if you have any additional questions, you can reply to that email, then I will get you connected with Cam.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so, okay, another question. Do you know if there are any other walls like this listed in the National Register in Michigan or anywhere?
There aren't in Michigan. There are walls like this throughout the United States, but I believe many of them have been torn down. And I should have known the answer to this because I was asked this in Quebec too, in Montreal, and I was suspected it might come up again. But again, it was a loophole in the Federal Housing Authority manual that you could actually do a concrete barrier. And so it was a loophole that developers did take advantage of in terms of building an actual wall. But this is, as far as I know, this is the only one that's still standing.
Yep, I saw Megan's comments in the chat.
Yeah, so there's one I thought there was one in Florida. Yeah, so there's one similar to this, Megan saying, in Miami.
Okay, we only have a few questions left. Next question, Queen Evans does many adaptive reuse projects. Can you talk about a few of your favorites?
Oh, geez. That's a great question. Gosh, let me think. This is definitely a highlight. This isn't an adaptive reuse project per se, but we are working with MDOT on the decommissioning of I-375 in Detroit, which is a highway that was put in place in the 50s, I believe, that went through Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. So historically, again, went through a historically Black neighborhood and community and business district. So we're working with MDOT in the city of Detroit to come up with design ideas for how to, design ideas of how to reactivate the 30 acres that will be reclaimed from that highway decommissioning project. So that's one that I'm working on currently that I'm really excited about because it's really a way of redressing some of the wrongs that were done and looking at how we can honor the history of the displaced with art, with trails, with parks, with just how we can kind of help address what was done. So that's one that we're at the very early stages of, and we're leading a consultant team that's advising in terms of urban design, history, arts, and culture. And let me think if there's another one. There's so many. This isn't really an adaptive reuse project, but we're working with the University of Michigan to do an interior renovation of Angel Hall on State Street on Central Campus. It's Albert Kahn building, a beautiful historic building, and we're renovating the entire north wing to create classroom, conference space, offices, kitchen for the comprehensive studies program, so that they have just a befitting space for students and tutors and staff. And so that's really exciting, taking a building that's historic and really dated, and finding ways to kind of open it up for collaborative learning and collaborative work opportunities. So those are two of the ones that are on my plate. I'm sure as soon as this call ends, I'll remember others. But I can't really say which is my favorite. It's like your children. You love them all. Yeah. But those are two that I'm really excited about right now.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I may be contacting you again for future webinars.
Oh, thank you. Glad to come back.
I think we have answered all the questions, and
Okay.
thank you all for participating in the chat. And there's a lot of good information there. So thank you, Kemba, again for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so this is really great presentation. It's very important that we have time to discuss these topics. And before I let you go, I will announce our next webinar really quick. So our next webinar is scheduled for February 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And it is from advocacy to adaptive reuse, saving sleeping bear heritage. And hope to see you all next time. And then just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. You will receive the link to the recording in the next couple of days. And there will be a link to the survey. Please participate in the survey to help us improve our program. And thank you, Kemba, again, and thank you, everybody, for participating. Hope you have a great rest of your day.